every American citizen must have an equal right to vote.
The administration of elections is primarily a state and local responsibility.
Whether you voted for the very first time or waited in line for a very long time, by the way, we have to fix that.
Hi, and welcome to High Turnout, Wide Margins. This is Brianna and Eric. I'm the county clerk in Boone County, Missouri, and with me is my co-host,
Eric Fay, Director of Elections in St. Louis County, Missouri.
And today we are very excited to have Dave Kuennen. He is the team lead for engagement, assistance, and training with the Election Security Initiative that is part of CISA. So we had some conversations with folks from CISA before, but this one's going to be a little bit different. And we'll start out just by asking our usual first question, which is, Dave, how did you end up working in elections in the first place?
Well, thank you, Brianna and Eric. I'm really happy to be on the show today. I'm a long-time listener, first-time caller. It's really great to see this podcast in this space. I think I saw some commentary on Twitter, or maybe you guys talking about it in the first episode about how this, especially during the pandemic, this podcast kind of serves as some of those conversations you might have on the side of an election official conference. And it really seems to be serving that role, and I love listening to it. I'm really excited to be a guest today. But your first question, and how did I get into elections? So it's a bit of a long and winding story, but we got a little bit of time, so here it goes. I spent the better part of the past decade working in international development, focused on elections, and then the last 4 years working on elections in the U.S. at the Election Assistance Commission, and now at the Cybersecurity Infrastructure Security Agency. But my very first work in elections was in 2004. I had the opportunity to be an observer during the Gregoire Rossi gubernatorial recount in Washington State. So to set the scene for you guys, this was the first kind of statewide recount after the 2000 presidential election in Florida. We had 2.5 million votes cast, and the initial count had Dino Rossi leading by 261 votes, I believe. And they had two recounts, one automated and one hand recount. And the final tally kind of flipped it over to Gregoire winning by just over 100 votes. But I'm kind of this young guy, not too far out of college, had the opportunity to observe kind of various stages of the recount in a handful of counties. But the one I'll always remember, and I think this is kind of where I caught the election bug, was I was observing the recount in Ferry County. This is one of the least populated counties in the state, and just one of the few that had yet to phase out their punch card ballots. Anyways, they quickly kind of it was a small county, so they quickly recounted the ballots by hand, and then they set a few aside to a county canvassing board to adjudicate. And it was just like what you had seen on the TV related to Florida, right? People holding up the ballots to the light, looking for dimpled and hanging chads. But it was after 2000, so they had this kind of strong adjudication guidance, and it wasn't really too much room for interpretation. But at this exact point in the recount, one of the candidates was leading statewide by just 11 votes, and they had 3 or 4 votes that they were going to adjudicate, so it was pretty intense stuff. And the canvassing board kind of looked at this one ballot that was hanging chad, and they determined it was a vote for one of the candidates based on the guidance. But then they were writing up the kind of new tally, and the new tally had subtracted a vote from one candidate and added a vote to another candidate. And kind of here I am thinking, wait, how is that possible? Like, it couldn't be a punch hole for one candidate and then the ballot turned into a punch hole for another candidate. Like, that's what it would need to be for a 2-vote swing. And so I, just 24-year-old Dave kind of intervened and said, hey, that doesn't sound right. You guys need to kind of recount the stack and check that tally. And they recounted the stack, and turned out I was right, after a little bit of partisan posturing by the county canvassing board, and it turned into a 1-vote swing. And anyways, it's a long story short. I'm walking out of the building that day, and one of the observers stops me and kind of asks me where I went to law school. And I'm like, I didn't go to law school. I was just a young kid who kind of read the rules and knew a little bit of math. But it was a pretty surreal experience. I got to be in this place at the moment of time, and had a chance to impact kind of who might have won that election. I mean, the final tally was over 100 votes, and one vote here or there probably wasn't the end of it, but it was a pretty neat experience, and I got to see the ins and outs of kind of how elections are, how recounts are run. So I think that's kind of when I caught the election bug, but I probably didn't know it then. Fast forward a few years, and I'm a graduate student studying Russian language and the post-Soviet space. I kind of had pretty interested in U.S. foreign policy at the time. I think after 9/11 and after the war in Iraq, a lot of people my age were interested in foreign policy. I kind of got drawn into the what were called the color revolutions in the post-Soviet space: Georgia, Ukraine, Kyrgyzstan, and I'm fortunate at the time to get a fellowship to study abroad in Kyrgyzstan. And while I'm there, I meet this kind of young U.S. Foreign Service officer who told me that he had been an election observer in that country the year before with the OSCE, the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe. And I'm thinking to myself, like, wait a second, like, you're basically me. You're just this young guy with some language skills and a little bit of area knowledge. And plus, I've got a little bit of election experience, right? I've been a recount observer in Washington State. And I'm thinking, like, so, are you telling me that I could be an election observer? Like, it sounded like something that was completely out of the realm of possibility for me. And he says, yes. He's like, yeah, sometimes they just bring on people like us with some kind of language skills and folks who won't complain if they're, sent to some of the tougher parts of the country, kind of tougher places to live. And so I applied. The very next time I got back to the States, I saw an opportunity to go to Azerbaijan. I applied and I got selected. And I'm thinking, this is incredible. So I go on the mission, and anybody who's been on an international election observation mission, one of the first things you do is you assemble in the capital, and there's this team of experts that kind of brief you on, what's going on in the country, media landscape, the legal framework for elections, the electoral system, kind of how they set up their elections, who the candidates are in the political parties. And I'm just looking up at this dais of experts, and I'm thinking, man, I want that job. Like, I didn't even know that job existed. How is it possible that people get kind of paid to travel to interesting countries at interesting moments and look at their elections and their broader politics? And so I spent the better part of the next 4 or 5 years trying to get that job, kind of turning myself into an election specialist. I was fortunate to get a job at the National Democratic Institute, which supports it kind of runs assistance programs across the world, democratic development projects, election observation, and whatnot. And several years later, I kind of had that job. I transitioned into consulting, and I was getting paid to be an election kind of subject matter specialist, to work on election observation missions and election assistance projects around the world. And it was just this incredible experience, right? It took me to Pakistan and Sudan. I got to work on Somalia from outside Somalia. I was in Myanmar. Very, very humbling and incredible, experience. I didn't, growing up in Spokane, Washington, I never kind of thought that any of that would be possible. I guess, how did I end up at the EAC and then at CISA? So I guess I'm just around 2014, 2015, I'm thinking about starting a family and kind of having more stable employment. And I figured I could get a full-time job at an aid organization at the headquarters level, or kind of, meeting my interests better would be to try to get involved in American elections. And I had just dozens and dozens of informational meetings trying to kind of convince American election officials and folks that worked in the think tank world and the nonprofit world that kind of my experience might be useful. Domestically, heck, I think I met you, Eric, during this time. I think we met at the Istanbul airport on the way to Uzbekistan on an election observation mission. And I asked you for advice on how to get work in U.S. elections. Anyways, I just had lots of informational meetings, and I met Sean Green through the process, and Doug Chapin through the process, and the two of them I think Doug Chapin gave me a consulting assignment, and then in 2017, Sean Green and Brian Newby gave me a job offer to work at the EAC on the research team. I'll just be forever grateful to them for taking a chance on me. And I got to work on the election administration and voting survey, which every election geek's dream job, I'm sure, is to work on the EAVS. But it was just a really, really awesome time. And through that work, I got to know Matt Masterson, who was a commissioner for a bit of the time that I was at the EAC, and a few years later, when I was looking for something new, I was really fortunate to get this opportunity to come over to CISA. So that's a long answer to your short question about kind of how I got into elections.
So one of the things that I know that you worked on some when you were at the EAC and comes up a lot, I feel like, in conversations about whether the intersection of academia and elections and just general data analysis is the EAVS data. So can you talk a little bit about your experience with the EAVS data, any kind of challenges that you encountered while working with it, and kind of maybe some of the evolution, if you want to touch on that too?
Sure. I mean, really, really fortunate to get to work on the election administration and voting survey, as I mentioned, right? It's the most comprehensive election administration and voting data out there, right? It's a census of all election jurisdictions in the country, and it's kind of an accounting of all sorts of vital things about how elections are run. Basic things like how many individuals are registered per jurisdiction, how people are getting on the voter rolls, right? Mode of registration, mode of voting, and you never really know kind of what data is going to be interesting at any given moment in time. And I think that the pandemic really shined a light on that this year, right? So when I was working at the EAC, we spent a lot of time looking at kind of the voter registration data, a lot of the public conversation or at least advocacy interest or legal policy discussions were about, automatic voter registration, automated voter registration, same-day voter registration, a lot of interest in list maintenance. And so we were kind of spent a lot of time looking at that data and how to improve that data. But the pandemic comes around and all of a sudden people are looking at mode of voting data, which was always relatively interesting. It was incredible, people trying to look at this really important question: how do we meet voter demand and try to have less voters in the polling place itself, right? Can we shift some of them to early in posting? Can we shift some of them to voting by mail? And if we do voting by mail, how do we make sure our rejection rates are at a reasonable level? And so people are looking at the different data points that hadn't gotten a lot of scrutiny in recent years, and that's really, really interesting stuff. I mean, even the age of poll workers data was relevant for the first time. I used to go around the country giving presentations on the EAVS data and kind of what we knew about elections, and the age of poll workers slide was just kind of a laugh slide. It was like a here's what we already all knew already, right? Poll workers tend to be older, and it sometimes I got a laugh. And all of a sudden that data is hyper relevant to kind of the policy and procedural questions of the day, right? How do we make sure that our poll workers are, tend to be, or how do we, if this population group is more susceptible to adverse consequences from COVID, right? How do we make that group younger for 2020, especially in the urgency of the primaries and later for November. So the data, I mean, I guess this is just to talk, this point is to say, you don't know what data is going to be valuable at what moment. I think, you know, I think you had Paul Gronke on from Reed College. You know, they've got this survey with the Democracy Fund on local election officials, right? They had some questions about retirements, right? I think they're presumably looking at just broad questions of professionalization in the field and career trajectory. But then this data they had on expected retirements after 2020 was kind of more relevant in the context of the kind of the ongoing harassment and threats that election officials are facing during 2020 and post 2020. So I think both of these kind of anecdotes speak to kind of the value of having this baseline data, because you don't know what's coming around the corner, what will be the issue in election administration for years to come. Anyway, that's just some kind of top line thoughts I had about the EAVS. I'm happy to talk more.
Hey, one question I had concerning EAVS, and I don't know to what extent you can speak to it, but I know one at least concern with the EAVS is that jurisdiction states or localities sometimes don't report all the information. You know, maybe some county just doesn't respond to the survey, and then there's just a hole there. And maybe there's also a concern that a state or locality misunderstood the question or is responding incorrectly to the survey question. And from your former seat at EAC, where you were doing this, to what extent can the EAC reach back out to those entities and say, hey, I don't know if this data point looks exactly right, or could you go back and ask, XYZ county if they, could respond to this, that kind of thing? To what extent does that happen, and if at all, and
right.
Does it help? I don't know.
Right. So I guess first thing I'd say is please reach out to the EAC or their partners at Forest Marsh Group who do the survey, right? They're going to know the latest and greatest. This is, the EAVS is not my baby anymore to manage. So highly recommend you talk to them directly. But I can speak broadly to some of this. We had this kind of goal, or three kind of interrelated goals with all the things we were trying to do with the EAVS, right? We were trying to make it easier to complete, right? The survey is a huge burden on, the folks who fill it out, especially in the states that push it down to the locals and don't have all that data at their fingertips through their statewide voter registration database. And number two, right, we're trying to improve data quality and completeness, right? This is a huge survey, right? It touches, I think there's 6,500 some odd respondents, 300, I'm probably getting the number wrong, but several hundred data fields that every respondent is expected to fill out, right? And very nuanced questions, right? You got to phrase the questions in a way that makes sense to all election officials in the country. And with this hyper decentralized setup we have, that's a tricky thing to do. And you also have kind of sticky questions, right? These questions were written, some of these questions were written, in the 2004, 2006, the first iterations of the survey. And you kind of don't want to change your questions too much, right? Because people want to be able to do longitudinal analysis, studying, how people responded, 10 years ago to today. So that's the second thing, but they've made a lot of strides in that regard. And then the third thing is how do we make the survey more useful to end users, and especially election officials themselves. And that third part of it was kind of where I spent a lot of time. Happy to talk more about that on this podcast if that's where things head. But the second piece, right, is this data quality and completeness. I mean, the main thing that the EAC and Forest Marsh, the current contractor for the EAVS, do is they send the data back, right? They get all the data in, they review it, they look for some things that could be kind of flags. This number looks a little silly or potentially incorrect based on what you replied last year or based on how you responded to a different question. An obvious one would be, you said you had same-day registrants, but your policy survey answer. The policy survey is the statewide survey that asked them questions about the policy framework in the state. So you responded to the policy survey saying you don't offer online voter registration or same-day registration, but here in the survey itself, you're saying you process this many voters same day or this many voters online, right? It can flag some of that data. And so these kind of flags, basically every state gets a memo, kind of detailed memo of things that the data consumption team has flagged, and they kind of get an opportunity to correct it or look into it before they certify the data as final. And I think that process itself, I got to see it go, I got to see that 2 times when I was there. Like, that's gotten a lot more involved since the early days of the survey.
So transitioning in, you were at the EAC, you're now over at CISA, and you're working a lot on engagement, it sounds like, but what now, heading into the 2022 election cycle and beyond that 2024, what kind of projects are you working on now that I guess local election authorities should be aware of or can participate in?
Before I talk about what we're focused on as we head into 2022 and beyond, I think it's helpful to reflect a bit on where we've been. Since 2016, CISA's work in the election sector with our election partners has included establishing an information sharing and analysis center for the election sector and building its membership to include all 50 states and more than 3,000 local election offices, and hosting 4 national tabletop exercises for election infrastructure stakeholders and more than 50 exercises for state and local election officials and their partners. Reflecting on this, one of my main takeaways from the 2020 elections in the last 5 years is that the rationale behind the 2017 designation of election infrastructure as critical infrastructure, that state and local election officials should not be expected to combat sophisticated state-sponsored threat actors alone, remains as true today as it did in the aftermath of 2016. So what does all this mean for 2022 and 2024 and CISA's election security mission moving forward? The first thing I want to say is that election security remains a top priority for CISA and DHS. We're not taking our foot off the gas just because 2020 went off without any cybersecurity or physical security incidents that disrupted core election operations. We can build off the great work the election community has done in the last 5 years to bring even more people into this election security community of practice, including election officials in small and mid-sized jurisdictions that we haven't been able to reach since 2016, and all the new people who are entering the field following the 2020 elections. Secondly, we fully recognize that election officials are facing an even more complex election security problem set now than they were in the aftermath of 2016. In addition to threats posed by foreign cyber threat actors, election officials are also dealing with unprecedented levels of election-related mis, dis, and malinformation and threats to their physical safety and security. So we're looking to make sure we continue to add value in the area of cybersecurity, but also to expand our activities that help strengthen the physical security of election infrastructure and personnel, as well as activities that help election officials and their private sector partners to combat rampant mis, dis, and malinformation regarding election infrastructure. I'd like to highlight a handful of CISA services that election infrastructure stakeholders may want to take advantage of ahead of 2022 or 2024. First and foremost, I want to promote 4 new and updated election security trainings that my team delivers both in person and virtually. These include a CISA election security overview training that summarizes the threat landscape and a broad range of CISA services available to election officials. 2 cybersecurity focused trainings that take a deeper look at the risks posed by ransomware and phishing. And a new training called Building Trust Through Secure Practices that seeks to help election officials navigate the new post-2020 environment and better communicate their security practices to their voters. We've delivered 39 of these trainings over the last year, including with you all in Missouri, reaching more than 2,700 election infrastructure stakeholders. Second, I want to make sure your audience is aware of CISA's exercise offerings. In addition to our annual Tabletop the Vote exercise, we can also host state-level exercises or exercises for individual jurisdictions or election vendors. In addition to the 4 national tabletop exercises we've hosted more than 50 exercises with election infrastructure stakeholders since 2017, and I believe we have 7 scheduled so far for the next year, including 1 in Missouri. Finally, I want to encourage your election official listeners who have not done so already to transition their website to a .gov top-level domain. Since administration of the .gov top-level domain transitioned to CISA at the end of April, approximately 500 state and local government offices, including election offices, have transitioned to .gov domains. .gov is now available to election officials at no cost, and our team stands ready to help you make the transition. In this era of unprecedented levels of mis and disinformation about elections, we want to make sure your websites and email addresses end in .gov to help signify that election officials are trusted sources of official government information on elections.
You've reached out to a lot of election officials, but you mentioned you're trying to make that relationship kind of deeper, reach out to more people. There's that old football coach saying, everybody has a play, everybody has a plan until the other guy smacks you in the face, and then it kind of goes out the window. So for the regular local election official out there, come election time, they have something happen, and all the training or advice they've received from CISA, maybe that goes out the window in a worst case scenario. What can they do? Who can they reach out to in kind of an emergency situation like that at CISA to help get back on the right track?
Election officials are natural contingency planners. Needless to say, it's essential for election officials to have plans in place to document how you and your staff would respond to a cyber incident. The same is, of course, true for natural disasters, physical security incidents, and other potential disruptions to election operations, especially disruptions that may occur during the election period when core election operations like voting or counting are taking place. But it's not enough to just have a good plan in place, right? You need to test it and be ready to dust it off when an incident occurs. We at CISA have multiple no-cost customizable products and services that can help election officials establish an incident response plan and exercise your incident response muscles a little bit. The first product I'd like to highlight is our Cyber Incident Detection and Notification Planning Guide for Election Security. This guide includes worksheets and templates that can walk you through how to establish a cybersecurity incident response plan for your office or enhance your existing plan if you already have one. Secondly, I want to highlight again our exercise offerings. As I mentioned before, our exercise team can work with your state election office or state association of local election officials to organize a customized tabletop exercise for your state. Tabletops and other exercises like them are a great way for you and your staff to get some practice responding to hypothetical incidents. But we all know that even the best laid plans can go out the window in the heat of the moment. If you haven't tested your plan or built the necessary muscle memory around it, are you going to make the right decision when a cyber incident occurs? Probably the most important thing you and your colleagues need to internalize from your incident response plan is, who do you need to reach out to first when an incident occurs? Every jurisdiction is going to be different here, but for cybersecurity incidents involving election infrastructure assets that are managed locally, this is probably going to be someone in your information security office or IT department. This could be someone in your election office or perhaps in your county or municipal government. While CISA is likely not going to be your first point of contact when responding to a cybersecurity incident, we of course encourage election officials to notify us and our partners at the Election Infrastructure Information Sharing and Analysis Center, or EISAC, about cybersecurity incidents and potential incidents. This helps inform our understanding of what's going on across the sector. And in some instances, we may be in a position to provide additional incident response assistance to complement whatever assistance you're receiving locally or from your state.
Okay, that was another episode of High Turnout, Wide Margins. Big thanks to Dave Kuennen for being our guest, talking about CISA stuff. We hope you enjoyed it. We hope you listen next time to High Turnout, Wide Margins.